Salutations, fellow nerds, I'm Rick Y, and today is March 6th, 2025. In 2005, Princeton University Press published a little-known book by Russian historian and anthropologist Alexei Yurchak. This book was called Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More. In this book, Yurchak's primary thesis was that during the period of the Soviet Union's collapse, many people in Russia and other Soviet states continued to just act as though everything was normal, regardless of the reality around them that was indeed the system was falling into disarray. While having a lovely conversation with one of my longest time friends who is currently living with her family in Europe, she brought up a term that had been coined in that book called hypernormalization. And given our current situations, I thought I would express the similarities and even glaring mirrored reflections that we can view looking back into historical examples. Let's begin, shall we? First, let's define what hypernormalization is, because a lot of people use the term normalization frequently without understanding the underlying history behind it. Hypernormalization is a psychological and political phenomenon where people continue acting as if everything is normal, even when the system around them is clearly falling apart. While it was observed in the Soviet Union during and before its collapse, it isn't unique. By the late 1980s, it was abundantly clear that Soviet communism was a bust. The general economy had failed, people were without their basic necessities, and the government itself had lost all credibility. Instead of fixing this, the government just continued to simply act as though everything was still fine. There was no official acknowledgement of the collapse by the government itself, and it had been a calculated decision. They still sent out these mythical 5-year plans that never panned out to anything tangible. The media still constantly spoke highly of communism as grocery stores began to completely run out of stock. Even the regular citizen went about their lives keeping their eyes down and acting as though keeping up the appearances of artificial comfort. But eventually this illusion fell apart. Reality came in like a wrecking ball, and literally overnight the USSR collapsed in its official capacity. The concept that everything was hunky-dory for such a long time left an atmosphere of confusion as Russians woke up in 1991 with no real plan of moving forward. This vacuum led to the rise of modern oligarchs, economic chaos, and the rise of a former KGB officer by the name of Vladimir Putin. Woohoo! Alright, somebody, quick, ask me how often I think about the Roman Empire. All joking aside, not that often, but it is relevant here, and I hope its inclusion will pique the interest of those who constantly think about it. First things first, while many folks have this impression that the Roman Empire fell overnight, that would be misguided, as the fall of Rome began in 476 AD, but people just kind of kept pretending it was fine for nearly 2 centuries, until suddenly it wasn't. Noticing a pattern? From going through economic turmoil and eventual collapse to political corruption as well as military failures, the Roman Empire had utterly overextended itself. But that did not stop the government from trying to keep the illusion of strength and prosperity alive, even as outside invaders were actively burning their lands. In fact, Roman elites would often hold lavish celebrations and built monuments to themselves as their cities were being overrun. And instead of fixing the economy or focusing on the success of their military strength, government leaders kept infighting and power struggles, not unlike our Congress does today, where winning elections overpowers the need to actually address social concerns. This began when Rome was split entwined betwixt 2 factions, the Gallic and the Palmyrian empires. As infighting only got worse and outside forces invaded and took land throughout the 4th and 5th centuries, the last emperor was finally deposed by a Germanic king. Instead of dissolving, Rome just kind of became irrelevant. A lot of reason for how slow the collapse was remained due strongly in part to the decentralized nature of their government. But unlike the USSR, where there isn't any single defining moment that caused its collapse. Now let's fast forward all the way to 1929. The stock market in the United States has just crashed. The economy was in abject freefall, and what did the Hoover administration do? It downplayed the crisis. Banks failed across the United States, unemployment was through the roof, and Americans across the nation were losing everything that they had. Hoover's government responded by trying to downplay the gravity and severity of the situation. Often, the government tried to convince people that it was just a short-term struggle that they would have to endure because a strong, thriving economy was just around the corner. And while many Americans continued to believe this, they were also losing their life savings, their homes, and some, their lives. Believing the crisis to be a temporary one, corporations continued to expand and went bankrupt before they accepted the reality of things. And when that reality did finally hit, it was a hard hit. For 10 years, the United States struggled through what would be later called the Great Depression. By 1933, 25% of Americans would be out of work, yet business tycoons and wealthy elites refused to admit these pitfalls, saying the economies would just bounce back. One of the primary talking points from the wealthy was that it was just a minor correction. Andrew Mellon, the Treasury Secretary at the time, said something very reminiscent to what Elon Musk recently said when he said, and I quote, "Liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate the farmers, liquidate real estate," which essentially means let the people suffer until the stock market corrects itself. Same with the premise that inflation would be something that we as Americans would just have to endure as the businesses telling us this narrative rake in record profit year after year. The playbook then is as it is now. Deny the crisis, blame the people, protect the rich, and downplay the suffering. Only after a quarter of Americans lost everything did they finally choose to do anything about it. And a little thing called World War II. I'm not trying to create content to scare, but to inform. Too many people during historic collapses went about their lives as if these red flags weren't waving. As we speak, political polarization in the U.S. is at an all-time high. The wealth inequality is the worst it has ever been in any country ever. Climate change is accelerating while conservatives keep putting it on the back burner. Trust in institutions is evaporating, while democratic norms weaken as Americans go about their lives with this bubble of exceptionalism around their heads. Currently, mainstream media outlets are so tied up with culture war nonsense that it is impossible to push it aside, and far too many Americans have lived such comfortable lives that they assume that nothing bad could ever happen here. If we continue to go about our lives like everything is fine, the U.S. could realistically experience a major crisis. And the question is, will we be able to adapt before it's too late? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below, and let's start having these tough talks. What is the biggest red flag that you see today? If you dig the content, consider liking and subscribing. I count on you, my viewers, to make this channel and message grow. All I ask is that you help this community. Don't wait for the illusion to break. We need to pay attention now. Thanks for hanging in there with me. Y'all come back now. You hear?